And if I press the on switch, a claw comes out and turns the box off again, basically undoing the good work of the last 3 seconds. This is what it sounds like. That's the whole point of the box. It's an exercise in inanity, but whoever bought it for me captured my love of novelty. It's one of my favourite ever Christmas gifts. If you're ever after a useless Christmas gift, that's about as useless as it gets. And we are going to explore the concept of uselessness and human behaviour and normality with the anthropologist we're just about to speak to, because there's a lot of concepts in our lives that we just take for granted. And so it's nice to bring in an anthropologist to get a bird's eye view on a range of topics. He's going to be covering eating insects, our attitudes to mental health, dying, and the whole concept of what it means to be normal. That's after this.
You're listening to ABC Radio.
Many of us have been craving for life to get back to normal, for us to feel normal again. With the concept of normality taking up so much of our attention, it'll be useful to get to know it a little better. Dr. Paul Mason is an anthropologist with the University of Sydney who might be able to help us out. Hello, Paul.
Hi, Ashwin.
Normality, it's a bit of an abstract concept. What is it about the concept that you find interesting?
Oh, it's multi-layered, really. Normality and the word normal is an interesting one because individually people have a sense of what it means. But if you actually stop them and ask them, define normal, a lot of people will go, oh, normal doesn't exist. But it's a very seductive term. It's ubiquitous. And you see politicians use it a lot. Boris Johnson is using it, the return to normal. Here in Australia, people are talking about getting back to normal. And because individually we're like, yes, I want to go back to normal. But collectively, what does that actually mean? So it's this ubiquitous term that is actually quite ambiguous. And really, it's a term that's only about 180 years old too.
Okay, tell us about the history of the term. In what way were people thinking about normality before then?
Well, to be honest, I'm not sure that people were thinking about normality the way that we think about it today. 180 years ago, in the 1840s, there was a gentleman trained in astronomy who became what we would call a demographer by today's standards. And he adopted a calculation from astronomy and applied it to human populations. So the law of error, to calculate where you predict a planet will be, a single moving object in space. And he took that calculation and applied it to populations of discrete individuals, each with their own developmental trajectories. And he called the answer, the result that you get at the end of, finding the average of a population, and he called that the moyenne, and later he called it the normal. And he saw the normal as representing all that was ideal within a society. And his name was Adolf Quetelet, if anyone ever wants to look him up.
Okay, so when he says ideal, is that a moral judgment, or is there some natural science basis for this word ideal?
Well, that's the interesting thing about this arbitrary figure, is that it gives the appearance of being objective, and it naturalizes cultural ideals and depoliticizes them and makes them look scientific, when really it's a misappropriation of mathematical methods from astronomy that are not very well adapted for human populations. Nonetheless, that flaw in mathematics has persisted over time and kind of snowballed into something completely different. You take the word normal outside of the clinic or the laboratory, and it no longer makes sense.
This era that this was being done, this is the era of scientific racism, eugenics, a lot of other applications of the natural sciences to human populations. Was this in that field of positivism, scientism, where we were trying to overly box and calculate human beings, often with malign political purposes? Yes,
sadly. When the word first appeared, it was quite a progressive term. It was quite a progressive idea, and to politicians and people in power, it was very seductive. It gave them something objective, something to point to and say, "See, this isn't just my idea. See, these calculations tell us it's true." But it became blended into that political agenda, and sadly, it has been used very widely to naturalise or depoliticise quite racist, sexist, and ageist ideals.
We might come back
to ableist
as well, yes. Yeah. we think of Western culture as being very individualistic and everyone can do what they want, but you would suggest that no, there is this inherent sense of what people should do, and being normal and conforming is still part of Western culture.
The word, I mean, the whole concept of normality is very conformist. We want to act normal, we want others to behave normal. It's about predictability in society. We want people to act and behave in very socially predictable and acceptable ways. But when you codify normality based on what is acceptable for one group and then hold that as the standard for all groups, you create very systemic problems of inequality.
If I could just veer into India, where I was born, there's just as a case study, in India you have Hindus, Buddhists, Jains, quite different religious groups, language groups, but they felt like they had a spine that was uniting them, and that was what they call the dharmic vision, which is about meditating, stilling your mind, adapting your consciousness. So there was supposed to be a common spine amidst all these various definitions of normal. Whereas I find in the West, perhaps the right side of politics at least, talks about us having a common language, a common culture, a common way. Do you think that we can live as a nation with different types of normal, different tribes with their own version of normal, as long as there's some sort of common spine that connects them?
I love what you're talking about. And is that a Hindu concept?
Yes, it's Dharmic, which is Hindu, Buddhist and Jain as well.
Right, which are much more inclusive and democratic and religions than, say, the political agenda to normalise people and to really, the word normal is very much about pulling people into the centre and has a homogenising force on people. And interestingly, even though we think of ourselves as an individualist society and we think of ourselves as individuals, we nonetheless have very powerful, positive drivers for homogeny under the name of normality. The products that we're buying at the supermarket, the clothes that we're dressing ourselves in, the way in which we use energy at home, our resource extraction, it's all driven by a very powerful homogenizing force that can fall under the umbrella and be labelled normality. So I think it's quite interesting that we don't seem to tolerate diversity as well as we claim to tolerate diversity. And one of the big problems with the word normal is that the word normal, by its very existence, creates the possibility that you violate norms. Whereas if you're talking about a body and you're talking about the spine and you can understand different parts of the social community or part of the social community has different parts of the body and all connecting to different parts of the spine, that's a much more inclusive and I think beautiful way of thinking about the way in which people can tap into a central force, but not necessarily all have to be one part of the same body.
Yeah,
they can all be different parts of the same body.
Yeah, I wonder if we have almost thinking of it like a computer system. You have applications in the operating system. The West applications are very diverse and sparkly. Any gender, any sexuality, any race, any lifestyle goes. On the surface, it's a very tolerant, open society. But when I look at the foundations of it, Christianity has a strong concept of believers and non-believers, sinners and non-sinners. The Greek ideas, of symmetry and it just seems like there was a bit more of black and white categorical thinking within the West foundations that are still there. We still think of the good guys and the bad guys, even if outwardly we're still quite open to diversity. Our sense of what's normal is still buried and quite strong still today.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, to go to the roots of something like Christianity, there wasn't really the concept that someone was a non-sinner. Everyone was born into sin and everyone had to seek repentance and reconciliation with God. And so the interesting thing about Christianity is at the very roots of it, we're all abnormal from birth because we're all deviations from this beautiful standard which was known as God. And I'm trying to talk in the theological terms of Christianity, and apologies if someone else has a different interpretation. But but what we see at the advent of this idea of normality 180 years ago is the way in which normality was used, the concept was used to abrade religious values. Suddenly, people were given a different excuse for spending items on themselves or spending money on consumables for their home, in the name of cleanliness, which was a new norm, in the names of comforts for the home, in the name of health, it was normal to be healthy, it was abnormal to be unhealthy, and so, you would buy products for the home that would help you maintain good health and good cleanliness. So I think normality in some ways actually pushed aside religious values in a number of spheres, and because it was kind of that contestation between science and Christianity, albeit a very flawed interpretation of science.
Interesting. So part of our progress as a modernising society is to set up new norms for health and home and consumption.
Yes, and, by giving people, the Victorian religious values of restraint said you should be frugal, you shouldn't spend too much money on yourself, you shouldn't have a lavish lifestyle. But suddenly, people were, oh, hang on, I think I'm getting a bit of a bad chest. I should go to the sanatoria retreat by the sea and have a 2-week holiday. Or I should go to this spa resort. Or I should buy, this new vacuum cleaner for my house. I need to buy it because I need a house that's presentable. So what we see in the last, more so over the last century, is an increasing consumerism under the name, under the guise of adhering to social standards.
You're listening to Dr. Paul Mason, who's an anthropologist with the University of Sydney. What was it about the hoarding of toilet paper during COVID-19 that caught your attention?
What really caught my attention was the number of people who were telling me, oh my gosh, it's just crazy. Everyone's hoarding the toilet paper, and then they go off and do it themselves.
Yes. Yeah, one rule for me, one rule for everyone else.
Yeah, and there was a lot of finger pointing, and I even heard. So I also work at Taronga Zoo and work with some people who work in behaviour change, and I even heard some of them saying, people are acting irrationally, and I think the more interesting question is, why was toilet paper and toilet paper hoarding a rational choice in the face of a viral pandemic? The toilet paper wasn't protecting us from the virus.
No.
And toilet paper, hygienically, is actually not more hygienic than using water and soap.
Which is a method that most Westerners aren't used to, though, is it?
No, it's not their normal, if you will.
No.
And so I think really what the toilet paper hoarding was about was, my sense of normality is being disrupted. I think what I want is to maintain some semblance of normality during lockdown.
So that was our social safety blanket?
I think it was our social safety blanket. I really think so.
Interesting.
The idea of having this thin sheet, maybe 2-ply, 3-ply at best, between our fingers and our feces was, gave us a sense of normality that, yes, there's this virus out there, but I still have the social etiquette.
I think there is something to this because there's that whole theory in psychology, isn't there, terror management theory, when there's a lot of chaos going on, you just want to simplify your life. And sometimes that's voting in a politician with simple answers. Maybe this was part of that terror management theory. Just you can control your toilet situation at home, and let's at least try and control that.
Yeah, I think there's something there to be studied. There's certainly a hypothesis there that we can test.
To look into. You've also started eating insects recently, so we're exploring normality from a few different angles here. How is that?
Just to clarify,
Yes.
Just to clarify, this has nothing to do with the pandemic.
No. There's a COVID-safe cicadas that you've been. Where are you finding these insects?
So there are there are people in Australia who are growing insects for human consumption. And in fact, there's people all over the world who have been harvesting insects for human consumption in Thailand, Japan, in Mexico even. You can buy, chili crickets
Yes.
at marketplaces.
What does this say about our ideas of normality? The fact that we don't eat insects, and it's even a talking point that you are.
What fascinates me about culinary norms, and they're just one example of the norms that we have in life, is how deeply ingrained they become in our body, to the point that we can confront something that is entirely edible, but something that we're not accustomed to, and we have these visceral reactions to it. I've baked cricket cookies for colleagues at work and offered them round, and in a very COVID-safe way, of course.
Yeah.
And some people can't even bring themselves to eat one bite. Some people have one bite and then they're like, okay, they really have trouble swallowing it. It's such an offensive idea to step outside of your culinary comfort zone that it manifests itself in the way in which people have to hold back, their vomit response.
Yes.
And so what that tells me is how our cultural behaviours become biology. They become part of our very bodies. And so while we can talk about normality being very arbitrary and being made up and being invented, it has nonetheless become part of our biology.
You've covered a couple of topics in this interview. We talked about the COVID response around toilet paper and insect consumption. Another area of normality is in mental health. And most people are guided on mental health by psychiatrists and psychologists. But do anthropologists have something to say about the way that mental health professionals label human beings can also have an impact that we should consider?
Absolutely. The labels of someone not being normal can stay with that person for the rest of their life and have deleterious outcomes for their quality of life, their health and their well-being. By labelling disorders, on the one hand, you're saying, oh, well, we expect people to conform to their society and the standards of their society. If someone is unable to meet those standards, whether it's, that person's not productive enough, or that person's not learning as well as the other people, or that person is disruptive for whatever reason, then let's correct that misbehaviour. Let's correct the disorder and assume that the social standards have to be adhered to. Whereas I think there's an interesting critique that you can turn it around and say, well, actually, maybe there's something wrong with the social setting. Maybe there's something wrong with our cultural standards. Maybe we can flip this on its head for a moment and entertain the idea that, well, maybe we can change the environment rather than expecting the individual to adapt.
And it certainly changes your focus, doesn't it, to look at in what ways our culture is producing mental illness.
Oh, gosh, yes. We have particularly this year, we've seen that we have a very anxiogenic culture. We have a culture that induces anxiety about big problems. These are big problems, but they're not problems that are not confrontable. And we've seen a lot more investment in mental health services. And I guess my concern, which is probably not an immediately obvious concern, but the concern for me is the way in which the values that we promote through mental health services then bleed into other areas of our lives. And they compel adherence to norms that perhaps we need to question.
Can you give us an example of that?
Yeah, so, someone might not be as productive as the other person, but they might have other qualities that we could value, creativity or, other kinds of qualities or skills that we don't recognise them, that we don't necessarily recognise if we measure that person's worth by the rubrics of productivity or the psychometric scales that we use in applying for jobs.
This idea of labelling people as schizophrenic or depressed or anxious, it's giving the scientific community the strongest, the most control over the person's description, because this is maybe what's happening in their minds biologically, neurochemically. This is what's happening, but it doesn't really see them as a whole person or as a person situated in a social situation, like you were saying. So do we have to be wary about the level of scientific language and conceptualizing we allow into our lives so that, we don't get pigeonholed too much?
I think you've completely understood the direction I was taking with this. So thank you, Ashwin. You're very reassuring for my ability to communicate.
Good, thank you.
I think we do need to be wary, yes, and we do need to realise that, if we don't bring a very healthy philosophical approach to the ostensible objectivity of science, then we could unmoor ourselves very quickly. What we consider through medical discourse as dissociation could be considered saintly trance in another place, like Brazil, by people who practice candomblé. What might be considered a depressive disorder by psychiatrists in Australia might be considered being a good Buddhist in Sri Lanka. Some societies don't understand anxiety as anxiety. They understand it with a different rubric. Schizophrenia in some South American cultures, people with schizophrenia are recognised as having sacred abilities that are worth listening to, and this puts value on the person who has these experiences. For some people, it's a momentary period in their life that they go through, and things change, and that label doesn't stick with them forever. And so people can have very fruitful experiences in other cultures of things that we might label as a disorder in our own.
Another area where normality comes into being is the final moments of our life and how we choose to pass away. And we've had conversations in the past about new research into microdosing with LSD and other hallucinogens to take some of the fear and concern and anxiety, in fact, out of death. Is this an area that you think the West can look at to change our ideas of what's normal when it comes to dying?
I think lysergic acid, LSD, is an interesting one because it's a relatively new drug. The first acid trip ever was only last century.
Yes.
But the use of hallucinogenics, of course, has been around arguably since humans became human. And hallucinogenics have been highly valued in societies around the world, and rituals have been created that have allowed these substances to be a part of the society without being problematic. Unfortunately, the way in which Western societies are structured, these substances have been an excuse to marginalise people, to stigmatise people, and that stigma has unfortunately put a lot of that research into the too hard basket. Getting grants to do research on LSD was very difficult when it was being banned. The only studies that you could do of cannabis, while cannabis was seen as a bad drug, were studies demonstrating that cannabis was bad for your driving. Whereas now we're recognising, well, actually, we need to stop inflecting our ideas of where research funding should go through our cultural bias and start recognising that these substances have uses that we still don't recognise. And, the question about death, well, it kind of indicates just how poorly we understand death in Western societies and how poorly we deal with it. We sort of cordon it off. We want to put it behind the walls of a hospital or, some other kind of place. We want to cordon it off. We want to see death as an abnormal event. But, if we actually take the calculations of the average seriously, then what is normal is death. Life is actually the abnormality. And, we don't have a lot of peace and calm around ideas of death. Death is seen as something we should avoid. Death is seen as something that we should try and put off for as long as we can. And I think that's part of the anxiety that we feel about death. I want to get these things done before I die. I've got to get, there's this notion I've got to do things. And we've lost the notion of being.
What would be your suggestions for people listening as to what they should do about normality? How should they think about it and confront some of their own ideas about normality?
3 things. First thing is, if you hear the word normal, actually stop the conversation and go and question it. What does someone mean by normal? And often you can pull that word out of the conversation and replace it with a more precise description of what you're actually desiring instead of the word normal. And then you can disrupt it. This is the second thing. So you can disrupt those ideas of normality. So rather than just going, yes, but normal doesn't exist, and then moving on in the conversation and completely forgetting that you've actually tried to challenge normality, take that challenge seriously and really try and disrupt your notions of normality. Once you've learnt to question and disrupt your ideas of normality, you can then start to refuse it. And you can start saying, no, actually, you know, these standards are healthy for me, or they're not going to work for me. I'm going to create space in my life for behaviours that I value, behaviours that I would like to promote, and behaviours that I would like to promote to others, rather than adhering blindly to norms simply because everyone else around us is adhering to them as well.
What's the benefit to an individual who challenges normality in that way?
Well, I think you'll lead a much more fulfilling life. I think the myth of normality is an obstacle to self-fulfillment. If we are constantly trying to act and behave in ways that we think everyone else should be acting and behaving, then we're not being self-reflective about our own values, where we want to go in life, what we enjoy, where we feel most creative. And I think once you create space within your mind, within your heart, for your own authentic growth, then I believe you'll lead a much more fulfilled life.
Authenticity seems to be a common theme in philosophy, and it's a beautiful place to end. Dr. Paul Mason is an anthropologist with the University of Sydney. Dr. Paul Mason, thank you again for your time tonight.
Thank you, Ashwin. Always fun to talk with you.
You're listening to ABC Radio.
I'm Ashwin Segkar with you today, filling in for Craig. And if there's one group that is disrupting